John McArthur, thank you very much for joining us here at the Fung Global Institute and sharing your thoughts with us. Let me start now by looking back a little at the Millennium Development Goals. What would you say, if you take stock now, that you could have done differently?
I think the biggest thing that we've seen is how ideas diffuse. And the establishment of these goals in 2000 was not a firm, unveiling of the curtain. It was much more the beginning of a broad process of people understanding that goals can matter, and then crucially that they need to be linked to resources, and they need to be linked to institutional processes that take goals seriously. And so one of the things we've seen in the past decade plus is how those pieces can come together. And we saw that in areas where there's no resources, you don't see the progress. In areas where the institutions aren't taking the goals seriously, there's much less progress. And crucially, we've also seen that in areas where the business leadership comes together with the government leadership, comes together with the science leadership and the non-governmental leadership, those are areas where you get the most powerful coalitions. And so today, as the world is really preparing for post-2015, as it's being discussed, we're seeing a lot of those coalitions try to get organized before the unveiling, if you will, of the curtain, and seeing how they can really start with the team as lined up as possible.
One of your big successes, would you say, is the reduction of poverty. Could you explain that a little further?
I'm not sure if it's my success, but it's the world's success. We've seen already a cut of more than half of the world living under $1.25 a day in so-called purchasing power parity terms. So the amount of extreme poverty has been cut from roughly 40% of the developing world to roughly 20% of the developing world, 5 years ahead of the deadline for 2015. This is an extraordinary success globally. And Jim Yong Kim, the president of the World Bank, just yesterday gave a speech calling for zero extreme poverty by 2030. There's rounding error and technicalities around exactly how we're going to measure that, but we've seen an incredible decline. And if you actually continue that line, and even Bono gave a TED talk on this recently, we actually have the possibility and the viability of getting to zero within a generation, which is an extraordinary feat of humanity.
Critics would say that there is a blurring of line between progress in the countries themselves in terms of market forces, government drive to reduce poverty. So how would you distinguish between the successes of the Millennium Development Goals and actually what's been going on the ground?
Just because there's progress on the goals, that doesn't necessarily mean it's progress of the goals. And the goals as goals have prompted many new I would say, breakthroughs of progress. China was obviously doing extremely well on its own, independent of the goals. India was starting to do quite well, independently of the goals. So already we have a couple of billion people living in those countries doing very, very well. It'll take years for us to know with precision and the statistical sense what didn't happen, and even there we might never know. But I would say that based on my understanding and experience, we saw many areas of rebalancing between the public and the private sector. And one of the things we really saw was a reawakening to the role of the public sector alongside the market forces, especially for crucial services like health and education, and more recently for smallholder farming, the small farms of Africa in particular. And so one of the things we saw 10, 15 years ago was in Africa in particular, where there had been a generation of no growth, increasing poverty, pandemic disease rampant. We had the AIDS pandemic going to 25 million people infected, no one, literally no one on treatment thanks to any international efforts, 1 million plus people dying every year. We now have 8 million plus people on AIDS treatment. We have infection rates now starting to go down. The AIDS treatment revolution really woke up a lot of people to say, wait a second, there are these other diseases too, like malaria, like diarrhea, like pneumonia that are killing huge numbers of children. And we need to have health systems in these poorest places. And so where we've seen the biggest takeoff, I would say, in goal-oriented behavior is in global health. Huge increases in the budgets, huge increases in understanding it's not just about throwing money at problems, it's about goal-oriented, targeted financing, and then really growing these systems. Now, crucially, we've also seen that those places, and in my view, not coincidentally, where we've seen major investments in health and education, and most recently in agriculture, are also the ones that have seen big turnarounds in their economic growth, especially in Africa. We've seen very significant growth around Africa, not just in the mineral economies in the recent years, but also in the places like Malawi, where once they invested in the simplest things like fertilizer and seeds, things, by the way, that Asia did throughout the 20th century, once they had the policy space to do the same, they started to grow more significantly too. So I think one of the deepest breakthroughs of the past decade and the Millennium Goals is kind of a realignment of concepts, that it's not states versus markets, it's states alongside markets. And markets are very powerful forces. They do many, many things. But for the poorest people in the world, they don't solve every problem. And in those places where they don't, resources and government systems need to jump in. And in the places where the poorest countries can't afford it on their own, the global community needs to jump in. And that's where we've seen big institutional innovations like the Global Fund to fight AIDS, TB, malaria, Gavi, the Global Alliance for Vaccines and Immunizations. And again, in my view, we'll see what the evidence suggests a decade from now, these big investments in basic health, education, and infrastructure are starting to show significant returns in economic growth. And I think that'll only continue to amplify in the years ahead.
Let's look forward now to the post-2015
Right.
framework. Millions of people around Asia and Africa are living in areas which are very vulnerable to climate change.
Right.
How will the post-2015 framework accommodate these millions?
That's a big question. We don't know the answer yet. There's a high-level panel advising Secretary General on this, and it's co-chaired by the President of Indonesia, President Yudhoyono, and the President of Liberia, and also Prime Minister of the United Kingdom, with about 30 other people working on this. So they're going to make their recommendations at the end of May, and that's going to feed into a global conversation that I would say is already a bubbling cauldron of debates. And these environmental questions are significant, and I think we have to understand that the climate change issue, it's a deep one, it's a profound one, it's only one of multiple issues. We have other issues of air quality, air pollution. We have issues around water management, which is going to matter more and more as more and more places become more agriculturally productive, as more places transition to industrial production. Drinking water is just one small piece of the water system puzzle. Of course, we have rainforests, we have biodiversity, we have fisheries, we have oceans, we have many, many important things. The deepest challenge here is to understand that setting goals unto itself doesn't solve a problem. And we've seen that even on the MDGs, the environmental goals haven't seen too much traction. In some cases they have. Drinking water, we've seen significant traction in many places, but on a deeper sense they haven't. Climate change is one of the toughest policy problems in the world, where even with the science so strong, we're seeing what I would call a lack of agreement on how to share the burden or how to share the cost of solving the problem. And I think that we need to understand that this requires not just diplomacy at the political level, it requires diplomacy at the economic and financial level. My own home country, Canada, is not, in my view, playing enough of a lead on this. It's just withdrawn from the UN Framework Convention on Desertification, which is very much linked to climate change. And we're seeing real challenges on how to take these problems on. I think that there's a good chance, but it's far from preordained, that there will be a more serious global effort around the environment post-2015. One of the reasons I'm optimistic is that I'm seeing more and more Asian leaders really wanting to take this seriously. I did a paper recently with colleagues in the Asian Development Bank. We called it the Zen framework to post-2015 global development. And the Zen is for three basic parts. Z is the zero extreme poverty. everyone seems to agree now, which is great, that we have to get extreme poverty in its many forms off the map. 2 is what we called epsilon, or the extension goals, where each country has its own unique challenges, whether it's inequality, social inclusion, pension reform, what have you, that it really needs to take on, which is a country-specific challenge. But the 3rd is the N, the environment. And we're seeing these risks of flooding, inland flooding, coastal flooding. We're seeing these risks of the cost of environmental management. We saw Beijing just announce this past week that they're going to make major investments in environmental management for their own city. We're seeing movements towards carbon tax, which I think most people agree is the efficient solution to the problem, just a politically challenging one. But we're not there yet. And so my hope is that amidst the discussion around post-2015, people don't just focus on the paper documents with the goals, but they think about how are we really going to understand these problems? How are we going to set up peer review mechanisms to track these problems? And how are we going to make sure that there's a clear system that we all pay for the solutions? And that will reap huge dividends in the long term, but we need to understand, especially given the challenges and huge dynamics of Asia as the majority of the world's population, what will work for Asia will have to work for the world and vice versa. And so much of the question, in my view, really hinges on what works for Asia.
Now, let me just ask you about time, because it's I've seen your watch is 10 on the dot. Do you?
I should go in 2 minutes.
Okay, let's do one more then. Let me ask you quickly about, you spoke at length about market forces. Are they being brought more into the post-2015 framework?
I think the market forces are, again, balanced with the public sector necessities. One of the things we're seeing more and more of, however, amidst this, I would say, equal role of public and private sector as complements, not substitutes, is increasing leadership from the private sector wanting to help solve problems. And there's a huge interest right now to figure out how do we develop frameworks so that the major CEOs and the small entrepreneurs in the same breath can be part of a solution system, so they're not watching government and they're not watching a UN agreement, which has nothing to do with them, but they're part of a program that helps solve problems because A, they've got the resources, B, they've got the technology, C, they're driving the economy every day, and we need to have a stakeholder society in which everyone's contributing. The big question is, in my view, how do we build accountability? How do we have partnership not just in problem solving, but also in accountability, so that the CEO of any company feels just as accountable for their solutions and their contribution to a solution as the government leader needs to, and in my view also the non-governmental leader in civil society needs to. And how do we have this really joint stakeholder sense of accountability? That's probably a very 21st century problem. I think in a Facebooked world, we have a lot of ways to create new systems of transparency and accountability. But that is, in my own conversations with a lot of leaders in the multilateral system right now, a big topic right now. People are looking for creative ideas. So a conference like this one at INET is a great place for people to talk about that. How do you get the concepts right and these stakeholders aligned? So this is truly what I would call not just global goals, but a world of goals that each of us can carry forward for many years to come.
Let's talk about the private sector involvement then in the 2015 post-Millennium Development Goal framework. How do you hope to persuade business leaders and stakeholders from those sectors to be more involved?
I would say that we've actually already seen business leaders becoming part of the solution and wanting to be more of the solution. So you see CEOs, for example, from major pharmaceutical companies, from major agribusiness companies, from food companies, for example, making big efforts to make their technologies available, to make their skills available, and even their networks available. And that's actually been a huge part of this coalition between the public and private sectors. So whether that means making medicine available at marginal cost so that they can be purchased by the public agencies, whether it means the bednet manufacturers like Sumitomo Chemical ramping up their production so that it can be available again at a marginal cost or a lower price. Each of these new technologies and new systems can make huge breakthroughs, but it needs to work with the public sector. So the company making its technology available, they can't pay for the global problem solving on their own, and we shouldn't expect them to, but they can work with the public agencies that might or should be able to pay for some of that stuff, especially when it comes to these poorest of the poor public services. We've also seen, I would say, a business-minded approach really permeate much more of the development business, even where it's not a business, of course, it's public agencies. We've seen people like Ray Chambers, who's a pioneer of private equity on Wall Street, take on this goal of ending malaria deaths by 2015. And now he's actually become the Secretary General's not just special envoy for malaria, but also envoy for financing of the health-related Millennium Development Goals. What does that mean? That means pulling together the syndicate of actors who would work together to make sure that the public agencies are putting the resources aside, that the developed countries and the developing countries are all kind of on the same page. And often it means even using creative financial structures, drawing from the private sector, guarantee mechanisms and so forth, innovative finance, so that you can actually leverage the public resources to greatest effect and efficiency. So this business-minded approach of development has really, I think, gone a lot further. And then finally, you see some of the most famous business leaders in the world, like Bill Gates, making huge investments of $2 to $3 billion a year in a lot of global efforts. And that isn't just about the money itself, but it's about the innovations that it's supporting and even the public resources that it leverages. So you often see the Gates Foundation coming in with a little bit of money that helps unlock a lot of public sector dollars. And so there are many, many ways in which these business leaders are finding out how they can not just make direct contributions, but grow the team. So what does that mean for post-2015? For post-2015, in my own experience, first thing that the business leaders want is the governments to get organized. They want a sense of, tell us what the rules of the road are, get yourselves clear on what's the mandate, what's the mission, but then let's also work together, once that's clear, to figure out how we can fit in. You have some companies in the energy sector, for example, that are naturally focused on very long-range planning. You have other companies that work on a 3 to 5 year time horizon. And so 2015 is a lot to focus on, and that's a job to get done in the meantime. So I think the big question isn't not just how people can do things as the better angels, whatever business they're in, but how they can feel a sense, as we were talking about before, of joint accountability. How do we put frameworks together so that sector by sector, industry by industry, there are common standards for what not just good behavior looks like, but in my view, adequate behavior? How do companies meet not just their shareholder bottom line, but their public responsibility bottom line? And that's an industry by industry conversation. And it requires peer standards, and in my best guess, peer review as well. And it can't just be about businesses sitting in a room coming up with agreements anymore. That it can be about governments sitting in a closed room coming up with agreements. It has to be the business leaders saying, here's what our stretch goals look like, alongside the governments saying, here's what our stretch goals look like, and the civil society and scientific communities saying, here's what ours look like too. And I think with that very proactive approach, maybe starting on a 5-year time horizon at a time to launch things, we could start to see much, much more of this business leadership continue to proliferate, so that it's not just the Bill Gates of the world, or not that it is by any stretch, but in people's minds it's not just the Bill Gates of the world, but in people's minds it's every business leader in the world.
It must be still a tough job, though, trying to persuade business to get involved. You've mentioned there's heavy involvement, there will be more, but they're still not obligated.
No, and I think that many business leaders, maybe I'm biased because I get to work with the ones who want to do more, many of them are actually keen to just figure out how they can fit in. And this is not always easy, but you see many business leaders, they have, from a macro perspective, the resources, the corporate sector feeling more empowered in many parts of the world than the public sector, which is in many parts of the world feeling very back-footed. And you see many, many people just saying, you know, I will do what you ask me to do or what you suggest I do if I know that it fits into a solution. And so these problems, many of the global development problems, aren't silver bullet problems. They're problems that require the market mechanisms to work right. They need the regulatory mechanisms to be efficient. They need the public financing in place to unlock the return on private capital. And in issues like climate change, they need what the economists call the externalities to be captured. There needs to be a way to capture the public merits and public costs at the level of private behavior. I believe firmly in the role of government to get those issues right. And I believe that we have to make sure that we're not shortchanging ourselves on public investments in a penny wise, pound foolish approach to the long term. But we just need to understand that so many business leaders want to do it right. I think that the vilification of business leaders isn't right. I think we've seen the power of market-based innovation throughout the world and how incredible a force that is for unleashing prosperity everywhere. Of course, at the same time, we're seeing a lot of businesses cut corners in many sectors. We can't minimize that. Those are often regulatory failures, and they're often failures of self-regulation. And so we have to be thinking through, again, how to set fair rules of the road that capture the costs and provide clear signals for what accountability looks like. And that is not unto itself a simple problem. We shouldn't underestimate it, but it's a solvable problem. And most of the great lessons of the past decade are that each of these problems is impossible right up to the moment it gets solved. And then once it gets solved, everyone feels like they knew how to do it all along. So I believe that this question of how to get the corporate leadership accountability structures alongside the public sector leadership accountability structures and the civil society structures is a solvable one if the right ideas and motivations are in place.
Okay, it's countdown time now to the expiry of the Millennium Development Goals. Mm-hmm. Tell me about what you think that the UN Secretary General is going to say in his statement.
Well, tomorrow, April 5th and 6th, marks the beginning of the final 1,000 days of the Millennium Development Goals through to the deadline of December 31st, 2015. So this is an important moment. 1,000 days is pretty tractable from most people's perspective. They can think of it in terms of their current jobs, their current roles, their current responsibilities. What are they going to get done over the next 2.5 years? We have seen a lot of progress on many areas of the Millennium Development Goals. We've seen many areas make progress in a very short amount of time, actually. Things like malaria control, AIDS treatment, and so forth. But we've also seen that many of these issues require kind of foresight and planning. I think that there are a bunch of areas where we could see pretty significant breakthroughs between now and the end of 2015. We're on the verge of, for example, eliminating mother-to-child transmission of HIV, which is a phenomenal achievement compared to where the world was a decade ago, where anyone with HIV was basically looking at a death sentence in the developing world. That isn't just about eliminating the transmission, but it's actually about an AIDS-free generation and the advent of a new generation free of the disease. That's an incredible accomplishment for humanity. If we get there, I think that again opens up a whole new way of thinking about how to solve problems that people thought were too hard. And we also are at the verge of possibly eliminating deaths from malaria on a similar time frame. Not getting rid of the disease, because that's a much tougher proposition, but at least eliminating deaths, because no one needs to die from the disease. We've seen roughly a 75% reduction in morbidity and mortality in many parts of the world from that disease. And we could see the final bit taken care of. It's an amazing accomplishment after a few thousand years of putting up with it around the world. We might actually soon see, and I hope we will, and I think we will, the eradication of polio from the planet. It'd be the second disease after smallpox to actually be eliminated from humanity. It's an incredible accomplishment. So we have many of these things that will be bottom line metrics that are very easy to get our heads around and very easy, well, not necessarily easy, but very doable to achieve. Then there are many other problems that are a little more complicated, tackling hunger, malnutrition, and stunting. There are prospects for some breakthroughs in the next few years, and I think that actually could be very exciting for tackling a lot of big problems. There's an effort to get child mortality down through some of the new immunization efforts. Gavi is launching a big effort to roll out these new immunizations for pneumonia and diarrhea to 50 countries. There's a prospect of saving 4.4 million lives, according to some of the UN leaders, by the end of 2015 if we achieve those goals. And all of those lives are children under 5. So pretty remarkable possibilities in front of us. Secretary General, I anticipate, will be drawing attention to this tomorrow. We'll see what he says, but he's issued some statements already this week. And he has really said, this is a call to action moment. It's a very busy time, obviously, in the world. There's a lot of strains on our headlines of our newspapers every day. But we have to keep in mind just how much success is underway and how much more could be achieved if we keep our eye on the ball. And I'm hoping that people will hear that call, and it's not just going to come from him, it's coming from many leaders around the world. And for example, I've had the privilege to work with the Minister of Health in Nigeria, one of the toughest working environments in the world. And he and his team have an incredible agenda mapped out around getting even community health workers staffed across the country by 2015 as part of a very basic approach, but huge impact to build their health systems as part of an effort to dramatically reduce maternal mortality and child health and improve child health. If we get these things done with real success, even better than we've had so far, recognizing that it's not all perfect, but there's a lot that can get done. I actually think this can help us think more creatively and proactively about some of the other big issues in the world. I think this can help us think about, if we can solve this extreme poverty problem, we definitely should be able to figure out the global financial system problem. If we can eliminate the scourge of incredible diseases from humanity, we should be able to think about how to solve our carbon emissions problem. And I think that this notion of learning how to solve very difficult global problems is the ultimate question in these final 1,000 days. And over 1,000 days, each of us can do our part. And so the deepest question that I think, and the simplest one we can all ask each other, is what is each of us going to do, whether we're a company, the government, an NGO, an individual on the street? What are each of us going to do to make sure that this final 1,000 days is as productive as possible? Because the return on our personal investment is huge, not just to 2015, but in my view, for the next generation. And that's, I hope, the conversation we can have in the days ahead.
Okay, John McArthur, thank you very much.
Thanks so much for having me.